The days that followed their evening walk unfolded like a delicate dance, unspoken yet undeniable. For Margaret, time seemed to slow in Daniel's presence. She noticed things she hadn't before: how he filled the rooms with life just by existing, how his laughter carried like sunlight through old curtains, how his silences spoke louder than any words. For years, her cottage had been a place of stillness, a place where grief lingered in corners like shadows. Now there was warmth in the air. Music played softly on the old radio again. Meals were no longer eaten in silence, but shared with conversation and small smiles. Daniel fixed things without her asking: the loose step on the porch, the leaky faucet in the kitchen. He moved through the house like he belonged there, and in truth, he did. But what unsettled Margaret most was how natural it felt. How easy. One rainy evening they sat together by the fireplace. The flames danced, throwing golden light across Daniel's face. He leaned back in the armchair, holding a book but not reading it. Margaret knitted quietly, though her fingers fumbled more than once. She could feel his gaze on her, steady and thoughtful. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low, steady, but his words carried weight. "Grandma, you've saved me." She looked up, startled. "Daniel, no," he interrupted gently, setting the book aside. "Not just by giving me a place to stay or cooking for me. It's more than that. You've given me something I thought I'd lost completely." Her heart thudded. "And what is that?" "Hope." The single word hung in the air like a fragile lantern, flickering but unextinguished. Margaret's breath caught. She wanted to respond, to remind him that hope was always within him, that she was only a guide, not a savior. But the look in his eyes held her still. He wasn't just thanking her. He was confessing something deeper, something neither of them had dared to name. The fire crackled. The rain tapped against the windows. And in that quiet, she felt the unthinkable stirring between them. "Daniel," she whispered, her knitting needles slipping from her lap, "you give me hope too." The admission startled her as much as it startled him. She hadn't planned to say it, but it was true. For years, she had lived in the shadow of loss, believing her heart had no more room to feel. Yet here he was, breathing life back into places she thought had turned to dust. Daniel leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze searching hers. "Do you ever feel like life gives you one last chance, even when you think it's over?" Her throat tightened. She could not deny it. She felt it every time their eyes lingered too long. Every time his laughter made her chest ache with something dangerously close to joy. "Yes," she murmured, "I feel it now." Silence fell again, but it was not empty. It was thick with longing, with fear, with a connection that defied the years and the names they carried. Daniel reached across the small table between them and took her hand. His touch was gentle, reverent, but it made her pulse quicken. "Grandma," he said softly, "I don't know what this feeling is supposed to be. I only know it's real. You're the only one who understands me right now. The only one who makes me feel alive again." Margaret's heart pounded. Her breath came unsteady. She wanted to pull her hand back, to remind him of boundaries, of bloodlines, of right and wrong. But her fingers trembled as they stayed in his, held by a warmth she hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel old. She didn't feel fragile. She felt seen, desired even, and that terrified her. She looked away, tears burning her eyes. "Daniel, what we're feeling? It isn't simple. I know." His voice cracked. "But it's the only thing that feels true." She turned back, and the rawness in his gaze undid her. The firelight painted him in golden shadow, and in that moment she saw not her grandson, but a man broken yet strong, lost yet yearning. Her lips parted, but no words came. She didn't stop him when he leaned closer. Didn't stop him when his forehead brushed lightly against hers, an almost childlike gesture of comfort. Yet filled with something more. For a long time they stayed that way, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. Margaret's tears slipped free, though she wasn't sure if they were born of joy or sorrow. Perhaps both. The moment passed, but its weight lingered. Daniel pulled back, his hand still clutching hers. He didn't push further. He didn't have to. The truth was already there between them, unspoken yet undeniable. Later that night, when Margaret lay in her bed, she stared at the ceiling for hours. Her heart beat like a girl's again, restless and confused. She wanted to believe she could box away the emotions, label them as nothing more than the tenderness of family, think the intensity of grief and comfort colliding. But she knew better. What had awakened inside her was something she hadn't expected. Something that scared her and thrilled her all at once, and though the world outside remained the same rain, ocean pine trees whispering against her window inside, she was forever changed. Even now, long after that night. When she looked back on Daniel's arrival, she could never explain it fully. She only knew that his knock on her door had altered the course of her life. The truth of what passed between them, of the emotions that had been born in those quiet evenings, still felt unreal, and perhaps it always would. Her eyes misted. "I know what it feels like," she said quietly, "to lose the future you thought was yours." Daniel's head lifted. His eyes, those hazel eyes so like his grandfather's, met hers, startled. "You do?" Margaret nodded, her fingers tightening around his. "When your grandfather died, I thought my life had ended. I didn't know how to get up in the mornings. I didn't know how to keep breathing when he no longer shared the air with me. Love has a way of taking everything you are and leaving you hollow when it goes." Daniel swallowed hard. For the first time since his arrival, he didn't look guarded. He looked like a boy again, lost and needing someone to hold his pain for him. The words between them became a thread, binding their wounds together. He spoke of nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering how she could betray him. She spoke of mornings where the bed felt like a graveyard. He admitted he didn't trust himself anymore, didn't trust love. She admitted she had spent years afraid of opening her heart to anyone again, even in friendship. Something shifted in that moment. Not just comfort, but a deep, unspoken understanding. Pain had carved them both open, but somehow, in sharing it, strange warmth filled the space between them. When supper ended, Margaret found herself lingering at the table. She didn't want the evening to close, didn't want Daniel to retreat to the guest room with his sadness. She poured them both more tea and asked about his work, his apartment, his friends. He answered, halting at first, then more freely. It wasn't just the details that mattered. It was the way his voice softened when he looked at her, the way his eyes lingered as if she were the only safe place he had left. Later, when he rose to head upstairs, he paused at the doorway. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "Thank you, Grandma. I don't know what I'd do without you." Her chest tightened. She wanted to tell him he would never be without her, that she would hold him through whatever storm he faced. But instead, she simply nodded, afraid that if she spoke, her own heart might betray too much. When she finally went to bed, she lay awake long after the house had gone silent again. The echoes of their conversation clung to her like shadows of grief, of love, of loss. And somewhere in the darkness, she felt a new truth stirring. Daniel had not just come to escape heartbreak. His return had opened something long buried in her, too. Something she was not sure she was ready to face. Cliffhanger. Could this unexpected visit heal wounds for them both, or open new ones neither was prepared for? The rain had cleared by the next evening, leaving the world washed clean. Puddles shimmered in the fading light, and the scent of pine and ocean salt carried through the air. Margaret stood at the window for a long time, watching the sky stretch into soft hues of lavender and gray. She had not gone for an evening walk in years. Her knees were not what they used to be. And walking alone had felt hollow. But now Daniel was here. "Would you like to take a walk with me?" she asked after supper, her voice tentative. Daniel looked surprised, then nodded. "Yeah, I think I'd like that." They set out together, side by side. The gravel crunched beneath their feet, and the evening breeze tugged gently at their coats. For a while, they walked in silence, letting the rhythm of their steps settle into something that felt natural. The world around them was quiet, but not empty. The chirp of crickets, the crash of distant waves, the occasional rustle of wind in the trees. Margaret inhaled deeply. filling her lungs with the sharp freshness of the evening. She glanced at Daniel, his face half-lit by the sinking sun. There was still sadness there, carved deep into his features. But something about the walk seemed to ease it. "You used to walk these roads as a boy," she said softly. "You'd run ahead of me, picking up stones and pine cones, always bringing back the heaviest thing you could carry just to prove you were strong." Daniel chuckled faintly. "I remember. You always said I'd ruin my back before I turned 10. I wasn't wrong," Margaret teased gently. Her heart swelled at the sound of his laughter. Had been too long since she'd heard it, for a while. They spoke of lighter things, the neighbor's dog that still barked at anything that moved, the berry bushes that would soon bloom, the summer fairs Daniel had loved as a child. But soon their conversation deepened, pulled by the gravity of their shared solitude. "I don't know how you did it," Daniel confessed, his voice low. "Losing Grandpa, and still finding a way to keep living." Margaret slowed her steps. The gravel crunched softly underfoot. "Some days I didn't. Some days I just existed. But I learned that pain doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. And if you let it, it can carve out room inside you for something new." Daniel turned to look at her. His eyes glistened, though he tried to smile. "I don't feel like there's anything left inside me. Just emptiness." She stopped walking, gently touching his arm to halt him too. "That emptiness you feel let's not the end. It's the beginning. A hollow place where something else can grow." For a moment, he simply stared at her, his face caught between disbelief and yearning. Then he nodded faintly, as though clinging to her words. They resumed walking, the air between them thick with unspoken things. Margaret felt the stir of emotions she hadn't expected, feelings she had long buried, believing them too dangerous for her age. Yet being with Daniel, hearing the tremor in his voice, seeing the way he looked at her as if she were the only light in his storm, it awakened something deep inside her. They reached the cliffside where the ocean spread wide and endless, the horizon melting into dusk. Margaret leaned on the wooden railing, breathing in the salt air. Daniel stood close beside her, their shoulders nearly touching. "It's beautiful," he murmured. "Yes," she whispered, though she wasn't looking at the ocean. She was looking at him, the strength of his profile, the gentleness of his gaze when he turned toward her. They fell into quiet again, but this time it was not heavy. It was full of words unsaid, of emotions both fragile and dangerous. As twilight deepened, a chill swept in with the breeze. Margaret shivered, and before she could speak, Daniel slipped off his jacket and draped it around her shoulders. The gesture was simple, but when his hands lingered at her arms, her breath caught, their eyes met, for a heartbeat. The world stopped. Margaret saw not just her grandson, but a man standing at a crossroads of heartbreak and longing. He looked at her not as someone fragile or elderly, but as someone who had carried the weight he now bore and survived. There was admiration in his eyes, but also something more dangerous. Something unspoken. When their hands brushed against the railing, neither of them moved away. The touch was accidental. Yet the warmth that spread through Margaret's chest was anything but. She pulled her hand back slowly, her heart racing. She reminded herself of who she was, of the years between them, of the rules that life had etched in stone. But the way he looked at her, it unsettled her. It stirred a question she dared not answer. "Grandma," Daniel said quietly, his voice breaking the silence, "you make me believe I can start over." Her lips parted, but no words came. Her chest tightened, a mix of fear and longing tangled together. She wanted to tell him that he could, that he was strong enough. That heartbreak didn't define him. But the way his voice trembled, the way his eyes lingered on hers, made it clear his words held more than gratitude. And for the first time in decades, Margaret felt alive in a way that frightened her. The walk back was slower. Their steps were measured, thoughtful, as though neither of them wanted to break the fragile thread that had formed between them. When they reached the cottage, Daniel paused at the door, his hand on the handle. "Thank you," he said softly. "For tonight, for everything." Margaret managed a smile, though her heart was pounding. "Always, Daniel?" He stepped inside, but before she followed, she glanced back at the horizon one last time. The ocean was vast and dark, mysterious and untamed, much like the emotions stirring inside her. She closed the door behind her. Leaning against it for a moment, her hands still tingled from the brief brush of his dot. And she could no longer deny the truth. Something had shifted. Something she was not ready to name. Cliffhanger. Was this comfort between them crossing into something unspoken? Something forbidden? Or was it simply the fragile beauty of two lonely hearts finding each other in the dark? Her cottage stood a mile from the small town outside Portland, where the sea winds curled around the cliffs and the pine trees whispered against her windows at night. At 71. She had learned to keep company with quiet things. The ticking of the grandfather clock her husband once wound every evening. The rustle of her knitting yarn, the soft hum of the kettle. She had not always been alone. Once laughter filled these rooms. Once her husband's deep voice carried across the porch as he called her name. Or the giggles of her grandson rang through the hall during summer visits. But years had a way of emptying spaces, leaving behind only echoes. That afternoon had been like countless others. She brewed her tea at 3, set 2 sugar cubes in her cup, and sat by the window where she could see the gray stretch of sky over the ocean. A scarf lay half-finished in her lap, and she had just begun another row of stitches, when a sound startled her. A knock at the door. It was firm, almost hurried. Margaret froze. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced. For a fleeting moment her heart lifted with the foolish hope that maybe, just maybe, it was him. But then she shook her head. Her husband had been gone nearly a decade. Grief played tricks like that. Setting aside her knitting, she walked slowly to the door, each step echoing against the hardwood floor. She hesitated with her hand on the knob, her heart drumming louder than the knock itself. Then she pulled it open, and the teacup she carried nearly slipped from her grasp there. Standing on the porch with a suitcase by his side was Daniel. Her grandson, the boy she had once cradled in her arms, was now a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends. His hazel eyes, so startlingly familiar, seemed to hold the same depth her late husband once carried. Yet behind them lingered shadows. A heaviness that made Margaret's heart twist. "Daniel," she breathed, her voice breaking on his name. "What on earth?" He gave a half-smile, fragile and uncertain. "Hi, Grandma. I hope it's not a bad time." Her throat tightened. A bad time. There could never be a bad time for him. She reached out, touching his arm just to be sure he was real. Warmth met her fingertips. "He was here. Of course it isn't," she whispered. "Come in, child. Come in." He stepped across the threshold, carrying with him the scent of rain and travel. The cottage, once filled with nothing but stillness, suddenly felt alive again. Yet even as Margaret bustled to set his suitcase down and guide him toward the living room, her mind whirled. Why hadn't he called? Why had he come without warning? When they finally sat, she poured him tea, though his hands trembled slightly as he held the cup. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face pale beneath a week's worth of stubble. For a while, they spoke only of small things, the weather in Seattle, how long the drive had been, the books she had been reading lately. But beneath his careful words, Margaret sensed something unsaid. It wasn't until she asked softly, "Daniel, are you all right?" that his eyes dropped to the floor. "I didn't know where else to go," he admitted, his voice low, almost breaking. Her heart ached. She didn't press further, not yet. Instead, she reached across the table and laid her hand over his. His fingers curled weakly around hers, and for a moment, the years between them melted away. She saw not a grown man, but the boy who once built sand castles on the beach, who once begged her to make blueberry pancakes at dawn. Now he was here again, and though his shoulders carried the weight of some unspoken sorrow, she felt an old spark of purpose rise within her. He needed her as the evening deepened. Margaret found herself watching him closely. The way he shifted in his chair, the restless tapping of his foot, signs of a storm inside him. She wanted to ask, to demand the truth of why he had arrived unannounced, but something held her back. He would tell her in his own time, and yet she could not escape the sense that this visit was not just sudden, it was life-altering. When the grandfather clock chimed 6, Daniel finally leaned back and let out a long, weary sigh. "Grandma," he murmured, "can I stay here for a while?" The words pierced her. Stay here? For how long? But she didn't ask. She only nodded, her voice gentle but firm. "This is your home as much as mine, for as long as you need." Relief flickered across his face, though sorrow lingered behind it. He smiled faintly, but his eyes remained clouded. Margaret's chest tightened again. Whatever had driven him here, whatever wounds he carried, it was heavier than he was letting on. That night, as she prepared the guest room and laid out fresh sheets, her mind circled with unanswered questions. Why now? Why suddenly? And what pain had carved itself so deeply into her grandson that he appeared at her door without warning? The house had been quiet for so long, too long. But now, with Daniel under her roof, Margaret sensed the stillness had ended. Something had begun, something she could not yet name. And as she turned out the lamp, lying awake with the sound of his breathing faintly down the hall, she knew one truth. His unexpected arrival was not a small event. It was a turning point, though she could not yet see the road ahead. Her heart whispered a warning, and a promised life was about to change. And what happened next would still feel unreal. Even years later, the cottage felt different with Daniel inside it. For years, Margaret had lived among memories. She dusted picture frames each Saturday, cooked for one though her heart still reached for the rhythm of cooking for two. Every corner of the house had belonged to her husband and their life together. And sometimes she had wondered if the walls remembered more laughter than she could now. With Daniel's suitcase by the door and his footsteps moving through the rooms, the house seemed to wake from its slumber. The kettle whistled louder. The chairs seemed less lonely. Yet Margaret couldn't ignore the weight she saw on her grandson's shoulders. The next evening, she decided to cook the meal that had always been his favorite as a boy beef stew with carrots and potatoes. Thick broth simmered slow with rosemary from the garden. She baked cornbread too, the way her late husband used to request on stormy nights. When the food was ready, she set the table for two. Daniel came into the kitchen quietly, his hair still damp from the shower. His shirt creased from being folded in a suitcase too long. He looked older than his 26 years. Something in his eyes had been aged by pain. Margaret smiled as warmly as she could. "Do you remember this stew?" He blinked, and for a fleeting second, she saw the boy he used to be. "Of course I do. You used to make it every Sunday after church." They sat. He spooned some broth, but she noticed the way his hand trembled slightly as he lifted it. He barely ate, though she knew he must have been hungry after the long drive. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the clink of spoons against bowls. Finally, Margaret set down her spoon and leaned forward. "Daniel," she said gently, "tell me what happened." His eyes flicked up, startled, then dropped to the table. He shook his head. "It's nothing. I just needed to get away." But she knew better. She had lived too long not to recognize the signs of a heart in pieces. She kept her voice soft, steady. "People don't drive 3 hours in the rain without calling for nothing." For a long moment, Daniel said nothing. His throat worked as if the words were stuck. Then, almost brokenly, he whispered, "She left me, Grandma." The room grew very still. Margaret's breath caught. "I thought—" His voice cracked and he rubbed his hands over his face. "I thought she was the one. We'd been together for 3 years. I was going to propose next month. I even had the ring. But his voice faltered. She told me she was in love with someone else. Someone I thought was my friend." His confession tumbled out, raw and jagged, like a wound torn open. Margaret felt her heart splinter. She reached across the table, took his hand in both of hers. His fingers were cold, his grip uncertain. "Oh, Daniel," she whispered, "I'm so sorry." For a moment he said nothing, just stared down at the stew he could no longer eat. His shoulders shook, though he did not cry. And in that stillness, Margaret felt an old ache stir inside her, an ache she had buried beneath years of widowhood. She remembered her own heartbreak. The day she lost her husband, the man she had loved since she was 19. She remembered the phone call, the sudden stillness, the way the world had tilted and never quite righted itself again. She remembered sitting at this very table with hands clasped, whispering prayers that no longer seemed to reach heaven.